Hey guys, welcome to this video. Today we're going to be going over how to create this explosion. To do this, we are going to use the Cycles render engine along with the WISP Fire Shader. If you don't already have the shader, there's a link down in the description below. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. Here I'm going to open up Blender 2.79. Up the top I'm going to change it to Cycles, and then I'm going to press X and delete, Shift A, add in a plane, S and 10 to scale it 10 units. Let's make it double, so S2 to make it double that. And then here we're going to give it a basic material, just a brown color. If you want to, you can texture it, but that's up to you. Here we'll just turn down the brightness. There we go, that's good. Now we'll select our lighting here, add a sun lamp, use nodes, and set it to 2. We'll also increase the size so the shadows aren't too harsh. In this case, I'm going to set it to 1. Then we're going to press Shift A, add in an icosphere. Here I'm going to press numpad 1, numpad 5, tab, go into edit mode, Z to go into wireframe, and we'll just press A to deselect, B to box select, select this bottom half here, X, and delete vertices. Alright, so here we'll press tab, go back into object mode. We'll then select this and move it up slightly, not too much, just a little bit. And then the next thing we need to do is we need to add a particle system. Before we do, I'm going to scale it down a bit more. So roughly 0.5 should be good. Then we're going to go ahead to the particle settings, and here we're going to click new to add a new particle system. We are then going to set the seed to something random. Here we're going to change the emission amount to 500, lifetime to 7, start and end at 2 and 3, random for the faces, random here for the lifetime, and then under the velocity, I'm just going to set this to 10, random to 10 as well, and upwards emission of 5. Under the physics, we're going to select fluid. We're going to add a small amount of brownian force. Then we're going to scroll down, turn off emitter, select none, display, and choose point. Alright, so now if we go to the start of our animation and press play, you can see we have a nice particle system exploding. Alright, so the next thing we need to do is we need to select this ground plane, go into the physics settings. Here we're going to turn on collision. In this case we're going to set it to roughly 0.5 or 0.45. In this case, this is just rough, it doesn't have to be exact. We're going to turn up the random for both, and then we're going to go ahead and try that out again. Looks good. Alright, so here what we're going to do is we're going to add a smoke flow. We're going to choose particle system, here fire and smoke, select our particle system. Here we're going to turn off set size and turn on initial velocity. I'm also going to set it to 0.5. So initial velocity here describes how fast the smoke is moving once the particle disappears. So a particle will create a smoke trail, but if we set initial velocity, then that smoke trail will also get some of that velocity of the particle. At this point it's 0.5, which means it gets half of the velocity from the particle. Now at the moment 0.5 is pretty fast, and all of these particles here are moving quite fast too. So we're going to set the subframes to roughly 5 or 6. We are then also going to increase the flame rate quite high, something like 5, because we want there to be a lot of flames for our explosion. Alright, so that is all looking good. Let's go ahead and press Shift A, add ourselves in a domain or a cube. Here I'm going to press S and 5 to scale it 5 units. I'm going to press numpad 1, G and Z to move it up, and move it up on the Z axis. Now we don't want to go above the floor plane because we do want some collision between the smoke and the floor. So in this case the domain here will have to be just underneath the floor. So something like that is good. The next thing I'll do is select the icosphere, scale it down a bit again, GZ, move it down, and then Control A and apply the scale. Alright, so the next thing we'll do is scale up the domain a little bit, so S and just scale it out, again move it just underneath. Then we'll go over to the smoke settings, select domain, then we'll set the vorticity to 2.1, scaling here we'll set to 0.95 just so it's a little bit slower. The dissolve here I'm going to set quite high, 25, so that we have the smoke lasting for a while. Here we'll set adaptive domain as well. And then the last thing here, the resolution, we have to be quite careful with. So if you have this resolution set pretty low, it means that the simulation you're doing is at a small scale. But if you increase this, for example, to 128, that means that you're dealing with a really, really big simulation. So ideally, you want to change this based on the environment and the size of the explosion. So here I'm going to set it to something around 56. Again, up to you, depends how you want the simulation to work out. Then the next thing I'll do is under the smoke flames here, we're going to leave the speed at 0.75, but we'll turn down the smoke to 0.6. Alright, so that is looking pretty good. I'm going to select the ground plane here and also add a smoke collision. Alright, let's select our domain and go back to the start and press play. Cool, so that is looking like a nice explosion. Now one last thing we have to do is we have to also apply the scale to the domain. So let's go back to frame 0. So we need to turn off adaptive domain and then press Ctrl A, apply scale. Then we can turn it back on again. It's just this weird bug where the domain changes size if you have adaptive domain still selected. So alright, we've applied it now. If we go back to the start, we can press play. The animation should look a little bit different. Yeah, like that with the big fireball going on. Alright, so that is looking pretty good. Here we can see though that the simulation itself isn't working too great. There's a lot of sort of dots and stuff, but we don't have to worry about that for now because we can just increase the resolution and that will all change. Alright, so one last thing I'm going to do is we're going to select our emitter here. I'm just going to turn down emitter here to 7.5. And then we'll try that one again. Yeah, somehow that looks better. So we just get a little bit more burn time before the explosion disappears. Okay, so that is looking good. Let's go ahead and set up our camera. Here I'm going to press numpad 1 and then Control Alt and numpad 0. We're then going to select the camera, GZ, move it up. Let's go into solid view. GZ again. Z to go into solid view, by the way. And then we're going to press G and Y, move it closer. We want the top of the camera to be with the top of the domain, but not too high up. Otherwise you'll see the smoke disappearing. Okay, so that is looking pretty good. Now one last thing we need is some ground particles around the bottom here. So I'm going to press Shift A, add myself in a cylinder. We are then going to press Tab, go into edit mode, face selection, let's go into wireframe and go back to frame 0. We're going to select the top face, hold down Shift, select the bottom face, X and delete faces, back into object mode, SZ to scale it, and S to scale. So we want it to be pretty small, and these are just going to be the particles along the ground that sort of give a bit more of a shockwave impact. Here we'll add a new particle system. We'll then select a random seed, set the number to 100. Then under lifetime we'll increase it roughly double of the other fire particles. Here we'll select 2 and 3 again for start and end. We'll also choose random. Then the next thing we'll do is move on to velocity. Here we'll set the emitter geometry to 10, then set random and Z to be 5. We'll leave it on Newton. Actually, this other one here I'm going to make sure is on fluid. This one here can stay on Newton. We're also going to turn off emitter, choose none and point. Okay, can add some brownian if you want to. Then we'll go over to the physics panel, edit as a flow, again particle system, fire and smoke. Select the particle system, no set size, initial velocity. In this case we want to set it not as high as the previous one, so roughly 0.25. Here I'm going to increase the sampling, roughly about 2 or 3. These ones aren't moving too fast, so yeah, we shouldn't need too many subframes for that. Okay, let's go back to the start and press play. You can see our particles moving outwards, and they do go for quite a while. So what I might do is select the domain. Here we'll go to the modifiers, and then we'll just turn off the smoke so we can see it a bit better. And then if we go to our cylinder here, and we go to the particle settings, we can see that's going a bit far. So I'm going to turn it down to 5 and just see how that one works out. That's looking a bit better. We want these particles to sort of shoot along the floor and not go up too much. So here I'm just going to turn it down to 2. And there we go, that's looking a little bit better. So we want a little bit of bounce and just want them sort of scattering along the ground. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. So now that everything is set up, I'm going to select the domain. We're then going to go into the modifiers tab, again enable the smoke. We'll go into physics settings. So before we can continue, we have to save the blend file. So here I'm going to go to File and Save. Select a folder wherever you want to save this, and we're just going to call it Explosion. Alright, so save as blend file. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go under Smoke High Resolution, enable it, set divisions to 2, FFT, and turn down the noise to 1.5. So the more divisions you have here, the higher resolution your smoke will be and the better it will look. But again, that means more baking time as well. Okay, so here I'm going to turn off Show High Resolution. We are then going to go to the smoke cache. We're going to change this to OpenVDB just because it works much better. We're going to change the float to half, leave it on Blosk. We're also going to tweak our animation, so here I'm going to change it to roughly 60 frames. Hopefully by then the animation will have completed, so let's go back to the start and just play this one out. So there we go, going pretty slow. Oh, that's probably because we have the high divisions on, so let's just turn that off for now. And we just want to see how far the animation goes before we should pretty much just stop rendering it. So at this point you can see all of the smoke is pretty much gone. We just have some wisps left, but yeah, pretty much most of it is gone around frame 55. So we just put 55 in there, and that means for the smoke cache we only have to bake it for 55 frames. Alright, so now that everything is set up, I'm going to enable high resolution again, go back to frame 0 and click bake. So this will take Blender some time and it will bake the entire animation, and then once it's finished baking we'll get on to shading the smoke simulation. Alright, so now our smoke simulation has finished being baked. We can see in the timeline there is a dark line along the bottom. This basically means that the files have been cached and are being read from the disk. So we're no longer trying to simulate this in real time, which is good. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is go over into the scene settings. Here we're going to go to color management and we're going to select filmic and then choose look type as medium high contrast. This basically just makes the scene look nicer and stops the sort of blown out whites that just become too bright. So after this we'll go to the world settings. Here I'm going to select use nodes and then just turn down the color by 1 slot. You can do this by scrolling on the scroll wheel just to move the slider up and down. Okay, so that should be good. Now the next thing we need to do is select the lamp here, and we just need to rotate it roughly 45 degrees. So here I'm going to press G and Y to move it along the Y axes, and roughly something like that should be good. So we want it at an angle against the smoke. Here I'm just going to rotate it a little bit more, and something like that should be good. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is apply the WISP Fire Shader onto our domain object. To do this, I'm going to select the domain, go to the material settings, and then we're going to go to File and choose Append. From here you'll need to navigate to the folder where you have the WISP Fire Shader, go to Select It, under Material we'll select WISP Fire Shader, and then click Append from Library. So now we've linked it into the blend file, but we haven't applied it to an object. So to do this, we're going to select the domain, go under Materials, and here we're going to choose the WISP Fire Shader. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is make a new window by dragging to the left. Here we're going to choose the node editor, and we're just going to make sure we are in the material nodes, and here you can see we have the WISP Fire Shader. So what we're going to do here is just go briefly over each of the fields and what each of the fields do. Okay, so the first field we're going to go over is the multiply node here. What this basically does is takes all the values of the flame and multiplies them by a certain amount. So you can imagine if we have a square rectangle here that can represent all of our values of different flame colors, and now if we multiply it, it will multiply that entire square rectangle and move it along the color ramp. So if we set this really high, we'll be getting lots more yellows and whites and maybe a little bit of orange, but if we keep this fairly low, then we'll be getting more of these darker values and the darker orange and sort of getting a different looking flame. So the same works for all of the other color ramps. Of course, it depends which one you use, but if you want to have brighter values, basically increase the multiplier, and if you want to have more crisp or different colors, then you can change that from here. Okay, so the next field here is the flame density field. This basically refers to how far through the burning process a flame is. So if it's burning lots and there's lots of fuel and it's really bright, then you'll be setting this to roughly 0.4, 0.5. If it's just sort of burning on the last pieces of fuel and it's not very hot and the flame's starting to cool down, then you'll probably want something around 0.15 or 0.18. So again, it's a scale determining how sort of thick the flame is and how strong it is as well. It will also affect the coloring of the flame. Obviously, when the flame is more dense, you'll have higher values, and when it's less dense, you'll have lower values as well. So this sort of works a little bit with the multiplier, but the multiplier gives you overall control through the entire burning process. The next field here is called fumes. It is basically a mix between using sort of like really high detail crisp flames and using more realistic smoke and flame mixtures. So if we set this to 1, which we probably will for this animation, this means that we'll just have nicer looking smoke and flames, but if you're just going for that flame look, then you can play around with this value and set it between 0 and 1. So emission is fairly straightforward. That's just how much light is being emitted from the flames. The smoke strength down here determines how strong the smoke is and how solid it looks. So this can be really good for when the explosion has just happened and you have that buildup of smoke around the flame. Setting this to quite high works quite well, but then you want to turn it down later once the smoke dissipates a bit. So for the smoke thickness and light absorption, we're just going to leave those as are. Here I'm going to change it to 150, but yeah, we won't be keyframing these values, we'll just be keyframing the first 4 here. Now the next thing we're going to do is go back to our scene here, and we're going to apply all of the knowledge that we learnt about all of these fields and keyframe our animation so that the flames look really nice. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to press numpad 0, go into camera view. Here we're going to go to the render tab, and I'm going to set this down to something pretty low, so around 25 or even 20, just so we can get a rough estimate of what the flame looks like. We don't need it to be highly detailed because that will take forever to render, but we just want the right amount so that we can tweak these values and it will look good. The last thing I'm going to do is go to sampling, and here we're going to change the samples back down to 64. We're also going to select this icon here. That basically means each frame has a random seed. Okay, so that is looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and press play. And what we want to do is we want to go back to the first frame where we start seeing flames. So in this case, frame 2. So let's go ahead and press F12. So here we can see there's a little bit of flame and a little bit of smoke, but not enough for us to change the settings here. So we're going to skip ahead to frame 3, where we get a little bit more. Now if we press F12, we should be seeing something different. Okay, that's looking a little bit better. Now upon detonation, we probably don't want to have that much smoke. You could have a little bit, and it could be like the fuel bursting out, but we probably don't want to really have that thick dark smoke just yet. So here what I'm going to do is turn down the smoke strength to 0.5. We're going to right click and insert a keyframe. Emission upon detonation is quite high usually because there's a very large amount of light and heat released all at once. So we can set this to something like 400. If that's too bright, we'll turn it down later. The fumes here will probably actually keep at 1 most of the time. But we'll just keyframe it just in case we want to change anything. Flame density at this point should be pretty high, so roughly 0.3 would be pretty good, but we can turn that up later as well. Okay, let's give that a test render and see what we come up with. The smoke is still quite high. I'm going to turn that down to 0.1, right click, insert keyframe. Emission is looking pretty good. Fumes is good as well. I'm going to turn that down to 0.9 and replace the keyframe. This will just give us a little bit more flames rather than anything else, like so, which is what we want. I might even turn it down to 0.7 and give that a go as well. Okay, so that is looking good. We have our keyframes inserted. Let's go along to one of these other frames here. So let's say frame 6, give that a render. Okay, so at this point we have a proper large fireball. So what we need to do to make this look good is we need to stop it from just being completely white, because that sort of reveals no detail, and we need some smoke to be generated from the starting detonation. So here we can turn up the smoke probably to like 0.75, right click, insert keyframe. Emission we're going to turn down at this point to around about 350, although actually we probably still have quite a high emission. So I'm just going to leave that at 400 because, again, once it expands and explodes, you have all of the light and heat being released at once, and then the light sort of fades away as the explosion dissipates and everything else. What we will do is we'll turn up the fumes here to 0.9 again, and the flame density will turn down to 0.25. So let's give that a render and see what we come up with. Okay, so that is looking a bit better. You can see that the smoke is surrounding most of the explosion. Doesn't look too bad. It could be, yeah, maybe it's still a little bit heavy. We'll turn it down to 0.5 just for now. Replace that keyframe and give it another render. So apart from that, it is still looking pretty good. So if that fixes most of the smoke, then I'm happy to leave that. So great. That one looks fine. Yeah, you see this outside here where it's not proper flame, that's basically just the smoke. So we do want some smoke, but just not too much. So what I might do is, if we just go back to the frame we were on previously, which would have been frame 3, I'm just going to turn up the emission here to 500. Because we do want it to be quite bright at the start, and since most of the smoke is masking the flame itself, we lose quite a bit of that emission. So, alright, let's go back to frame 6 here. That should be fine, those settings. We'll just skip ahead to frame 10 now and set up the correct settings for that one. So let's give it a render and see what it comes up with. Okay, looking pretty promising. There we go. So that is looking quite nice. We can see that we have a lot more flame showing up now, and the smoke has started to wrap around the rest of the flame as well. So now we can start bringing out the smoke a little bit more. Let's turn that up to 1.5, insert a keyframe. Emission we can probably turn down to like 350 now. Yep, that should be good. Fumes I might turn completely to 1. Flame density at, let's do 0.25 was good. Let's leave it at that. Alright, so give that another render. Okay, so you can see that now that we've turned the smoke strength up, we're getting a lot more smoke in our explosion, and it's a lot thicker as well. Again, it does reduce how much light is being emitted, so we might actually increase that again. Leave that at 400 just for now. Okay, so that is looking pretty good. Obviously it's messy here because of the samples, but we can tweak that later when we increase the samples for the final render. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. If you want to, we could even turn it down to 0.225. We need to insert a keyframe to make sure it's applied, and then just give that another render and see. So that is looking pretty good. I'm quite happy with that. Yeah, no, that's fine. So let's go ahead and skip to frame 13 or 14. Alright, so let's go ahead and give frame 14 a render. So at this point we have a lot more flame than anything else. So here we're going to turn up the smoke strength, probably to something quite high, even, yeah, 4 or 5. Insert a keyframe for that one. Now I'm going to turn down the emission because we have less smoke, so 350, not 250. And then the fumes here are good at 1. Flame density, yeah, no, that should be fine at 225. We might even turn it down to 0.22. Insert a keyframe, we'll just do it for fumes as well. Okay, let's give that another render and see what we come up with. So as we increase the smoke strength here, we should be getting thicker smoke, which will give a really nice, realistic, gritty look to our explosion. So here we can see we get a lot more definition around the flames and what is smoke and what isn't. Cool, so that is looking quite nice. Again, yeah, you have to find a balance between too much smoke and not enough. Again, what we're seeing here is mainly a result of the simulation. If we'd done the particles differently, then you might not be seeing this, but it's just the way it's worked at the moment. Okay, so that is pretty good. I'm still happy with how the framing looks and the coloring and everything else. So the next thing I'll do is skip ahead by roughly 6 frames to frame 20. Let's give that a render, and hopefully now we can start seeing that some of that flame is starting to disappear and become nice and orange and glow out of the smoke. Cool, so there we go. This is more what we want to see, the sort of golden glow coming through the smoke there. So it is still looking pretty good. I don't think there is too much more we really need to tweak on this. We could increase the smoke density, I guess, to 5. What we do want to do is, after frame 20, we want to start toning down the smoke density, because otherwise you get really harsh looking smoke here, which doesn't look too great, but it does look really great when there's fire behind it, so you have to find a good balance between the two. Okay, so that is still looking pretty good. I'm happy with almost every setting on there. So for now, at least, yeah, I'm just going to skip ahead. So let's go to frame 27, give that another render, and by now if we started losing quite a bit of flame, we can start toning down the flame density as well. So here we can see that there is not much flame left, and it's become very, very orangey as well. So let's go ahead and turn down the flame density here to 0.2, insert keyframe, fumes at 1 is fine, smoke strength we need to tone down. So at this point, maybe something like 3. And then the emission here is probably going to start reducing as well. So we'll set that to 300. Give another render and see what we can come up with. Yeah, at the moment it looks pretty good. You have to find a good balance between the emission and sort of looking a little bit grayed out and stuff. But yeah, for now it doesn't look too bad. And overall, I'm pretty happy with that result. Okay, let's go and skip ahead significantly, so almost by 10 to 34. Give that a render, and now surely we can add our final settings in. This should be one of the last couple keyframes. We basically only need a keyframe when there is flame visible in the scene, otherwise we can just leave it. Okay, so at this point, the only thing I really would want to change is the thickness of the smoke. Maybe the emission as well. We could perhaps turn that down to 200. Right click, insert keyframe, smoke strength we're going to tone down all the way back to 1. But everything else looks pretty good, so I'm going to give that another render. Again, keep in mind when you turn down the smoke strength, then the flames will become a little bit brighter as well. But the main thing, by default, it will be in Blender set to 1, so when you turn it back down to 1, it will make the smoke a lot lighter and, yeah, just make it not so invasive and so harsh. So now you can see we see a little bit more detail in the flames and stuff too. Okay, so it is still a little bit much for my liking. I might turn that back up to 1.5, but apart from that, it should be good. So the next frame, I'm guessing frame 40, we probably don't have any more smoke left. By smoke I mean fire, which means that we probably don't need to keyframe too much more. We'll just make sure that this one looks good in terms of smoke, and it doesn't look too thick. If it looks too thick, we can turn down the smoke strength back to 1. Okay, so I'm happy with that. I'm happy with all of the keyframes we've done. The last thing I'm going to do is we're just going to select this node and we're going to do some debugging frames. So what that means is we're going to skip to random frames in our timeline here. So you can see I've selected this node, and then you should be able to see all the timelines down here where we've inserted keyframes. We're just going to go between the keyframes and make sure that it looks all right. So here, frame 5, it could be frame 4, up to you. Just want to make sure it looks reasonable. Yep, here's fine. We still have some detail. It is detonating, so we shouldn't see too much, and it should be quite bright. Let's go ahead to frame 8. Give that a render. This is between 5 and 10, so it should be giving us a little bit more detail now and a small amount of smoke. Okay, so at this point, it is quite a bit of smoke. We might consider turning that down. So let's go over to frame 10. And let's turn that down to 1. Right click and insert a keyframe. Render that one out again. We don't want to have too much smoke, but we don't want to have too little either. So there's a good balance between amount of burn and amount of smoke generated. So of course at this point, because we're only in frame 10, that's less than half a second, so we won't have that much smoke generated just yet. Okay, so that's looking a little bit better. Let's debug at frame 12. Okay, so we're getting quite a lot more thick smoke. So let's go ahead across to frame 12, and you can, or frame 14 actually, and you can see we've set the smoke strength really high, something like 4. So that might be a little bit drastic, especially going from 1. So we're going to change that down to 2 just for now. Right click, insert keyframe, render that one out just to make sure it looks alright. But you can see that here on frame 20 we have set it to 5, so we just want a nice sort of increase. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 makes a little bit more sense in terms of smoke generation. Okay, so that is looking okay. Yeah, maybe still a little bit too much flame. Let's turn it to 2.5. Right click, insert keyframe. Give that one a render, and again, we just want to have a nice balance between too much smoke and too much flame. Cool, so that is looking fine. I'm happy with that. Alright, so let's do a debugging frame here, frame 17. We should be getting a little bit more smoke within the simulation now, which will give it a nice glowy effect from the flame underneath. Cool, so that is looking good. I'm happy with that. Skip ahead to frame 20 and 27. Okay, so that one's looking good too. Happy with that. Last one here, we'll just go between frame 30 and 34. Okay, so we've finished debugging all of our keyframes. Everything else is looking pretty nice, and it seems like it is ready to go. So the last thing we'll do is add some final adjustments. The main one is going to be setting the camera up so that we can get the most smoke in the frame without showing the clipping at the top. So we have to be really precise with this. We have to make sure that you can't see it disappearing into the top there too much. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the render panel. Then here we're going to increase the sample count to 192. Then we are going to select an output. Here I'm going to choose RGB, compression to full. Select output. We'll then just make a new folder called render, select render, and then click accept. So once you've finished rendering out this animation, you'll have a sequence of image files, PNG image files. So what you'll need to do then is just make sure you've saved this. You'll just open up a new Blender window. You can then go into video editing, click add, go to image, and select your images. So that's all you need to do. It will import a strip in for you, and then all you need to do is press play, and you can see your animation being played back, and then you can export it as a video or anything else. So there we go guys, that's the end of this tutorial. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, let me know down below. I'd love to see what you guys come up with. Feel free to leave a link below the video. I'll make sure to check them all out. If you have any other questions or queries or anything else about the Fire Shader, also leave them down in a comment below and I'll get back to you. But apart from that, hope you enjoyed it. Hope you have